So we are in kind of a part two of a moment that's in the Gospel of Luke. Last week, if you were here last week, we did part one, and we're just kind of jumping into the middle of the scene. So last week, Jesus preaches for the first time in the synagogue in Nazareth, and he does something extraordinary. He stands up to say he is the new Isaiah. He is the new prophet. He is the new Jubilee. And then the story just kind of ends. So today is the response to that. All right, something else I need to tell you. For those who are new to this sermon series, we're looking at different ways to think about home. And right now, Jesus is in his hometown. But really, it's about how are we home in our own skin. And we're looking at this image of a house. And the question that we have to hold over this month and a half together is, do you live in the house of love or the house of fear? You can go in and out of both of those houses, but one of them is the place where you most often reside. And how you understand Jesus, especially in Luke 4, it helps shape our choice. We see this in the tension of the text. I don't know if you caught that at the end of what John read, but there is a lot of tension at the end of this text. All right, there's two completely different things happening, and they both matter. The first is with Jesus, who I would argue lives in the house of love. The second is with the hometown crowd, who I would think, at the end of this story, live in the house of fear. So I want to jump back into it. And so if you remember, Jesus is in the synagogue. He just spoke. And honestly, people loved it. This is what they heard, or this is what they did in verse 21. Then he began to say, "Today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And it's just kind of like mic drop at this moment. Then verse 22, all spoke well of him, were amazed at the gracious words coming from his mouth. I mean, you could just picture it. They're so proud of their little boy who's become a man. He's been teaching and healing across the Middle East. Now he's back home. He's in Nazareth, and they're so proud. And they think all of them together are living in the house of love. Look at verse 22. All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words coming out of their mouth. They even said, "Is this not Joseph's son?" You just feel it. They're so proud. There's so much pride in what they're witnessing from Jesus. Until you get to verse 23. It happens. Jesus should have walked away. He could have left on top, but he didn't. He spoke one more time, and it struck the chord of fear. Look at verse 23. He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that you have heard you did at Capernaum.' And he said, 'Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown.' But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow of Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many with skin disease in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha. None of them were cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." Verse 28. When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, led him to the brow of the hill which their town was built, so they might hurl him. We're talking about Jesus. Hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. If this text is confusing, Well, it just is. It escalates really quickly. The crowd loves Jesus and about what he's doing and saying and the miracles he's performing and the prophecies that he's prophesying about. They love him until they don't. By the end, they're chasing him to a cliff in order to hurl him off. Why? How do we get from, look at Joseph's son, to we're throwing him off a cliff? It's all that stuff that he says in the middle. You look at it again. Jesus' sermon says he's going to bring release. That's what we learned last week. The sermon is God is going to help bring release to all people in bondage. But I think the people of Nazareth misunderstood what he was saying. They think he's saying that only God's people will be healed, meaning only the sick Jews will be healed. Only the Jews who are oppressed will be released and set free. Only God's chosen people can receive God's goodness. I mean, it's right in the text when they say, do here also in the hometown the things that we've heard you've done in Capernaum. They're saying, Jesus, be our healer. You want to fix things? Start fixing us. And that's when Jesus replies with a story about Elijah and Elisha. Remember when Israel was in pain and they needed help? Well, God did send help, but Elijah and Elisha also helped other people. They helped a widow who was not Jewish, but rather Syrian. They also helped a leper. He was not Jewish either. These represent a time when Israel in the Old Testament needed God, and God showed mercy, but God also extended mercy beyond their bounds of comfort or understanding. God healed more people than just Israel. And Jesus is saying, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to proclaim a global impact of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Just because we need fixing doesn't mean that God won't also fix them. And if God does fix them, that doesn't mean there's less of God to still fix you. It doesn't work that way. 2 weeks ago, Jesus declared himself as the bridegroom for all humanity. Last week we said he's the new Jubilee for all of time. And today, he's describing that all people everywhere have access to his healings. And I think this truth really deeply matters because it means no one, not even us, are void of getting and receiving Christ's love. God is open to giving love to everyone on planet Earth all the time. Jesus isn't here just to heal those who were a part of some sort of group. Jesus wants all people to be healed. And this is why the people in the hometown, well, they just get really mad. The Nazarenes have spent centuries building a worldview where God was privatized and very controllable. But now here's Jesus arriving on the scene saying, you know that box that y'all taught me as a child as I grew up and God fit perfectly in that box? Let me tell you something about that box. It's pointless. It's too small. We don't get to limit what God does and who God offers love to. And Jesus just reveals this truth to his hometown, and they go nuts. I mean, the best way I know to describe what's happening here is that Nazareth has moved back into the house of fear. Nazareth lives in the house of fear, where Jesus is trying to invite them into a house of love. There's something that theologians have noted for decades now, and it's a very clear understanding of the cultural context of first century antiquity. It's that people in Jesus' time lived in a cultural mindset of scarcity. Jesus' predominant culture was scared that there wouldn't be enough resources. And honestly, that's the mantra of people who live in the house of fear. They're scared there's not enough. And we're seeing it with the Nazarenes. They want Jesus to heal them only, but perhaps more importantly in that line is we need to make sure Jesus doesn't heal them, whoever them are. In a scarcity mindset, others become a real problem. They concern us because if they get some too, there might not be enough for us. And all of that, it just creates fear. And when you live in the house of fear, there's really no room for love, just lack. But when it comes to love, especially God's love, we learn that love is actually the one commodity that doesn't diminish when shared. It increases. And Jesus knows this and speaks to this. And I think that's his message in Luke 4, is that he has come to be a source of abundance in the face of such fundamental lack. And he declares that the kingdom of heaven is here. It's now. It's available to anyone who wants to participate in it. And I'm going to let all the oppressed go free. Everyone will have access to it. All people, if they're willing, can dial into it. There's enough seats at the table. There's enough space. There's enough love. There's enough room. In God's house, it is big enough for all of us and them. Now, unfortunately, Luke 4, it only shows us what happens when communities get rooted and stuck in the house of fear, when they cannot buy into a message of abundance because their worldview is such flawed with lack. Fear will eventually breed rage. Fear will eventually breed this terribly sad picture that we see in Luke 4 at the end of the text, verse 28. When they heard all of this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of town, led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so they might hurl him off the cliff. We're still talking about Jesus. Luke 4 is the case study on how not to be a hometown, how not to be a congregation. And we don't have to be like the people in Luke 4 if we are bold enough to move out of the house of fear and into the house of love. The way you make that move is you realize that love compounds itself. It is the one commodity that does not diminish when it is shared. It actually increases. And Jesus is asking us to recognize, when is it in our mindset or our theology that we slip into the house of fear? Because we need to find a way to move back into the house of love. And the way you do it is to know that there is plenty, there is enough for us and them. Let's be people who think it's amazing if Jesus heals and saves more people than just us. Let's be people who think it's amazing. And let's be people who celebrate that in Christ, there is enough for all of us. Let's be people who live and invite others into the house of love. Because love is the only commodity that does not diminish when shared. On the contrary, it magically, mysteriously, mystically increases. Because in God's kingdom, there's always enough.